Welcome, everybody. I apologise for the weather delay. So it's a great pleasure to welcome everybody here. This is an event on trust in elections. It's another event from the Georgetown Global Economic Challenge Network. This is a network which is an initiative of the President's Office. And a year or so ago, Jack said to me, you know, with the election coming up, wouldn't it be great if we had like a wider range of topics related to democracy? And I think there's nothing which can really be more important to democracy than the level of trust we have in our electoral system. So I think this is really a great topic and at a very extremely important time. You can see all the sponsors, so I'd like to thank all the sponsors. I can see Julia, who's supposed to be here, but she'll talk in a moment. I particularly want to thank Dom Banchoff's Office of Global Engagement and Julia Murillo and Mary Gordon, who are always a great source of assistance in these endeavours. I'd like to thank Laurent Bouton and Felipe Campante, who are the leaders of the DC Political Economy Centre. And I'd like to thank Bruna Santos for being welcome to be our moderator. So thanks very much.
I have a microphone here. Yeah, all good. I'm the one who should be apologizing for the delay. It was all my fault, so apologies. But here I am. I'm Bruna Santos. I direct the Brazil Institute at the Wilson Center, which is one of the only think tanks here focusing exclusively in Brazil. There we also have a program focused on restoring confidence in elections in Latin America, which is very aligned to this panel today. So I'm very grateful for the invitation to moderate this stellar panel with people that I've read, with people that I admire a lot, and people that I'm really looking forward to learn from. As has been said, we all know that both in the US and around the world, there is a challenge of trust in elections, of trust in political institutions. It's all due to a number of factors that we are going to discuss here today, including disinformation, especially in a world empowered by AI, in a world also where there is the rising of skepticism around electoral institutions and their independence vis-a-vis their governments, and also candidates that when lose sometimes may contest, may say that that was not the right result. So we have a number of factors that may align in different manners around the globe in different countries, and that's one of the things that we are gonna discuss here today. This panel will address each of the topics, and I have here today Julia Kajay. Hello, Julia. You're here in my back on screen. Julia is a professor of economics at Sciences Po in Paris and research fellow at CEPR and CSIFO. She has earned a PhD from Harvard University in 2014, and her research focuses on media, economics, political participation, and political attitudes. She has worked widely in economics journals and authored award-winning books on media, political funding, and conflict. In 2023, she was honored with the Best Young French Economist Award. I have also here with us Vincent Pons, and I apologize my French if I'm not pronouncing things well, who's a professor in Harvard Business School and faculty affiliate in the Harvard Economic Department. He earned a PhD in economics from MIT, and his research focuses on functioning and improvement of democratic systems. In 2023, he also received the Best Young French Economist Award, and he's the co-founder of the company Explain. Henry Farrell, who is the SNF Agora Institute professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS. His work covers democracy, internet politics, and international political economy. He has authored 2 award-winning books, The Political Economy of Trust, Of Privacy and Power, and he also has a new book, Underground Empire, How America Weaponized the World Economy, with Abraham Newman. And Miriam Kornblyth. Welcome, Miriam, who is the Senior Director for Latin America and the Caribbean at the National Endowment for Democracy, which she joined in 2005 2006. And she's an emeritus professor at the Central University of Venezuela and previously served as vice president of Venezuela's National Electoral Council from 1998 to 1999, overseeing 5 electoral processes. Well, I will start this conversation today, and I will do the following. I will ask you all one first round of questions, then we will also engage with the audience. So I really welcome you all here to prepare your questions for us to start this conversation. I will start with you, Julia. Hello, welcome. Julia, you have studied, and you have wrote a lot about the role of media in functioning democracies. And I want to hear from you, what are your thoughts on the role of traditional media? And also, what are the new forms, how the new forms of media are enhancing or not this phenomena of undermining of trust in elections? And thank you for being here with us.
No, thanks a lot, and very sorry not being able to make it to DC today. So this is a very complicated question, and I guess a very important one, in particular due to all the policy implications it has. If you look at traditional media, they're supposed to play a key role in informing citizens, both when they decide whether or not to vote, and then when they decide who they want to vote for. You can believe that thanks to social media, now people have better, easier, cheaper access to traditional media, to news, to political news in particular, and so that people are going to be better informed, which is not what we observe in the data. What we observe in the data is that people tend to be less informed on average, and that there is increasing information inequality. Those people that are informed tend to be better informed than in the past, but a lot of people just completely opt out of news and opt out of information. What is bad, and I think what is very dangerous for our societies and democracies, is the fact that a lot of people spend time on social media, and the kind of things that I have in mind are like TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, or call it X. They spend time on this social media and they believe that they're informed. So basically they're going to scroll social media, they're going to go through the title of some, articles from media outlets. They do not even know or read or try to know the name of the media outlets where the news come from. And from one title to the other, or just going through a number of comments, they believe they're informed enough. And this really weaken, in a sense, the democratic debate, because those people are not informed. And this also weakens the quality of the information that can be provided by traditional news media, because these traditional news media suffer from economic competition stemming from this social media. And in particular, if you look not only at like big national players, but in a country like the US, if you look at the local daily newspapers or local news website, as of today, they are not able to collect enough advertising revenues so as to have a business model that is sustainable. So basically, we have like traditional media that are hiring less and less journalists that suffer in their economic model. And even like look at media outlets like the Washington Post. 5 years ago, or even like 2 years ago, we all thought that, okay, the Washington Post was now doing like very, very well, much better than in the past, and Bezos saved the Washington Post. And what we see today is that, in fact, it's collapsing from an economic point of view and firing again part of its newsroom. So traditional media are weaker than in the past. Social media are weakening traditional media. They are used as a tool by a number of citizens to inform themselves, but they are not informed by this social media. And we have this third aspect that appears like 3 or 4 years ago with the development of a number of like new social media, for example, the one of Donald Trump, because there were this issue of, okay, perhaps we should regulate speech on social media. Perhaps people should not use social media to tell lies or like to use social media to weaken the democratic process. And when this regulation was introduced on social media, in fact, what we saw is that part of the politicians and part of citizens just like move from one regulated social media to another social media that is no longer regulated. And if on top of that, and I am going to finish with that, if on top of that you add the fact that there is also the issue, like before we knew that a number of traditional media outlets, basically they could be bought and used by owners willing to influence content and willing to influence the political debate. And this was well known, and we have a number of examples. And there were this idea that, okay, but as long as we have enough competition, we will have pluralism. But then you have the social media who entered into the market, and for a very long time, people never thought about the ownership of social media, because the idea was that social media were just a tool that allows citizens to talk to each other or politicians to talk directly to citizens, but that they could be considered neutral in a sense from a political point of view. And if you look at now what is happening in the US in particular, but it has consequences like all over the world, because like a social media like Twitter, X, in fact, is like acting in a number of different countries. And there is the issue of what is happening even like in Brazil as of today. You see that someone like Elon Musk is just using Twitter as a tool to try to influence the election. But then this tool is completely unregulated with a reach that is like much larger than everything we ever observed for traditional media, including TV channels. So we are in the middle of a mess where we really need more regulation with a tool that is very, very hard to regulate.
Thank you, Julia. And we are in Brazil right in the middle of this confusion, where X was just banned recently by a justice in the Supreme Court. And there's the whole discussion around regulating speech, regulating social media is all intertwined. And I just want to ask you a follow-up question. One of the things that I find fascinating about your work and what you just said is the fact that you are focusing on business models. And one of the things that you approached in your book, Save in the Media, is that there was a proposal for a business model that would be not for profit, that would be would not have advertising or government behind it, sustaining it. So I would love to hear your thoughts. Since you wrote the book till now, have you found like different pilots around the world that had experimenting with that business model?
Yeah, so two things. First, it is not because you are non-profit that you do not need government support nor advertising revenues. If you take the largest non-profit media outlet as of today, it will be The Guardian. And The Guardian, at the end of the day, do some advertising, receive some advertising revenues. The thing is that they provide news for free, but you can still subscribe or give money to The Guardian if you want to support this non-profit business model, and they make advertising revenues. The big difference between like a non-profit media outlet and a for-profit media outlet is that in the case of a for-profit media outlet, there is kind of a competition between two different goals. One goal being maximizing the quality of information you provide to citizens, and the other goals being maximizing profits you give to your shareholders. And if you look at one of the reasons why we saw a weakening of the news industry, in particular in the US, it's completely linked to what happened at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, when a number of large newspapers became publicly listed. And at the time they became publicly listed, basically they were like try at increasing the profitability of these media outlets, and this was at the expense of the quality of the news profit with the collapse in the size of the newsroom. You really see the change, just in the ownership structure and the impact it has directly on how much you invest into news and so on the quality of the news that is provided to the readers. So it's why I do believe that we should go for business models that are non-profit. So the Guardian is one, and it existed before I wrote Saving the Media. Another I think very interesting model of non-profit media organizations working pretty well is the one of AP, Associated Press in the US. Now, if you look at recent years, you add the ProPublica model that existed in 2014 when I wrote the book in the US, but that was developed now in a number of countries. You will have like similar outlets in the UK, in Germany, in France, where you just like produce news. You do not give like the news or sell the news directly to the audience, but you give it for free to any media outlet that want to publish it. If you look at a country like France, we had a number of media outlets that were for profit in 2014, and now that turns out to be not for profit. And I would say that the main example in France, it just happened like 1 year and a half ago, where Le Monde, which is the largest daily newspaper in France, before it was just like owned by for-profit companies, shareholders, traditional shareholders, and now it's owned by a foundation. So now it's like a non-profit media outlet. They still have a lot of advertising revenues. They still like receive revenues from their subscribers. They also receive revenues now Le Monde from OpenAI and like other big tech players, but still their business model is a non-profit one, which means basically that first, you cannot sell Le Monde anymore, which is kind of good, you know, because for a newsroom, they can like obtain some guarantee of independence and be like protecting for any, let's say, willingness of a number of large owners to buy them for political reasons. And second, it's good because it means that any profit that you make, you reinvest themselves in the newsroom. So I think we will have more and more media outlets like going for like the non-profit model, in particular because at the end of the day we will no longer be able to make as much money as we made with the news industry in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. In the US, you know, it works pretty well at a time where like even the New York Times at the beginning of the 2000s, they made 95% of their total revenues from the advertising industry. But this model disappeared and it will never come back because of competition coming from like very large like social media and like Google and other big players on the internet. So it's better like just to change the business model from this point of view. The only thing I want to highlight and insist on, it's not because you have a non-for-profit model that you solve the second threat faced by the news industry, which is the one of the lack of independence.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your clarification on this. And I want to move to you, Henry, and building on that and moving then to systems and AI. Well, I like your argument when you say that humanity has seen before vast and impersonal systems that with which we interact. It's not new about AI. For example, you use the example of bureaucracy as one of them. What's different about AI in this case? And how do you think that AI, if yes or not, brings new risks and opportunities to this scenario of this information environment where we see more and more mistrust in elections happening?
Okay, that's an absolutely huge question.
I'm sorry.
No. But it's also even worse, it's a huge question where we have very, very little data. And I should say that what I'm saying here, this is based, so the piece you quote from The Economist was written with Cosma Schlitzi. Also, I'm working with people like Alison Gopnik, James Evans, anything that I say, Marion Fourcade, anything that I say that sounds even slightly interesting or good is almost certainly one of their ideas. So I think one way that you might think about this is that if you look at the standard arguments that we have about AI and what consequences AI is going to have for elections, these are arguments which are really based upon a kind of a propagandist understanding of how AI is going to work. So crudely speaking, we have people like Yuval Harari, who argue that AI is going to allow for the manipulation of human beings at scale, that it is going to be possible to do things, to advertise, to shape people's beliefs, and to really sort of remake the ways in which they think about the world, so that it becomes, in a sense, something which is perfect for authoritarians who want to manipulate their subjects, and also extremely profoundly problematic for democracies, which will probably, in this account, converge upon how autocracies work. And what evidence we have suggests that that probably is a basically incorrect understanding of how AI is going to work. And I feel like I'm being surrounded here by French social scientists, but I want to bring two others onto the table, Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber, who have this really wonderfully important and influential account of how humans form beliefs. And we actually are much better at detecting propaganda, detecting bullshit, much more stubborn in keeping to our own beliefs than people usually give us credit for being. And this can have some very bad consequences. It means that, for example, sort of if we get back to what Julia was saying, one of the problems with social media is it makes it much easier if you have mulish and pig-headed beliefs. It makes it much easier for you to look out and to try and find other people who share your understanding of the world. You can converge upon some truly crazy things together. But this is not the product of manipulation. This is instead, it's a demand-side phenomenon more than it is a supply-side phenomenon. So I think if we want to think about what AI, and here by AI, so I should really say this is large language models because AI is a much bigger field. If we think about what large language models are, the arguments that people like Cosma and Alison and James and I make is we should really think of them as being cultural technologies which do, in a sense, for culture, what it is that bureaucracy, bureaucratic categories did for social knowledge, according to people like the anthropologist James Scott, and also in a certain weird sense, what it is that the price mechanism does for economic information, according to people like Friedrich Hayek. So in other words, what you have here is you have these vast existing systems which take these hugely inchoate and complex underlying realities. So the economy is incredibly complex, so too social knowledge, and they produce useful and lossy simplifications of that irrepresentable underlying complex whole, which you can then manipulate. And this is really what large language models do. They take all of this cultural information, these huge corpuses of text, or if you want to include diffusion models, images as well, and they sort of feed them, they turn them in, they vectorize them, turn them into sort of clouds of vectors, and then they allow you to manipulate this in a quasi-mathematical fashion. So I think that the dangers for democracy are not that we are going to be overwhelmed by a perfectly persuasive propaganda. They're plausibly more subtle than that. To get back again to what Julia was saying, so one possible, because it is so easy to produce content using this kind of technology, we are probably going to be in a much sort of messier and murkier information environment overall, in which sort of the products of real human beings and the products of LLMs mix and merge with each other. So it's very, very hard to tell what is what. This will also have consequences not for elections, but for other aspects of democracy, such as, for example, when the FTC or the FCC or whatever, they launch a new policy, they're required to have public comments. And it becomes very, very easy for large language models to overwhelm these systems, again, by producing superficially plausible, human-seeming content. There's a very nice paper by Wojciechowicz, if I'm getting his name correct, and Dedeo, which more or less argues using game theory and using computational science, that the problem here is that we rely for a lot of social aspects of democracy, aspects of how society works. We rely on sort of effort of producing a coherent sounding argument as evidence of that you are a real human being who has put work into thinking about this. All of these sort of proofs basically fly out the window, and that makes certain kinds of social cooperation probably more difficult than it is in the past. And I think that the final interesting implication, and this is stealing from another piece in The Economist that Marion Fourcade and I wrote last week, together with the other implication is, I think, that these technologies, they tend to be much better, which is a point Alison Gopnik makes, they're much better at reproducing culture than at encouraging variation. So that I think that we are in a world where so there are increased tendencies to copy, to build on what you've already done, and it becomes more difficult to produce the kinds of variety that you want to produce. But you could see this as having some perhaps possibly positive consequences as well. There's a really interesting paper that came out in Science last week from Rand and Pennycook, where they suggest that people with conspiracy theories, conspiratorial beliefs, who are confronted with large language models, so basically arguing against them, they have a persistent tendency over time to actually become less willing to believe in those things in the future. And here, more or less, what I think part of what is happening is that large language models are really good at grabbing out the consensus information of society and presenting it in an approachable form, perhaps sort of bringing people back a little bit towards the center rather than on sort of out towards the fringes. This has all sorts of problematic consequences perhaps in other ways, but in some ways, if you're worried about sort of people going off in 1,000 different directions, I think social media makes that easier. It is possible, perhaps even plausible, that large language models will in fact have a moderate tendency to bring people back towards the center again.
Okay, no, awesome. I do have a follow-up question, but I will ask you after since my question is too big. Well, for you, Vincent, you were an expert on the effect of voting procedures, right? The ID laws, early voting, voting by mail. How do you think that those procedures relate to enhancing or undermining trust in elections?
Thanks for this question, and thanks for having me in the panel. I'll make a few points. The first is why should we care about people trusting the elections? I was thinking about that as I prepared for the panel, and of course it seems desirable in and of itself, but I would argue that we should also care about trust because it's related to other things that we hope to observe in a democracy, which is that it's only if we trust that the election takes place in a fair way and in a transparent way that elected officials will appear legitimate. If you think that the election was fraudulent, of course, the legitimacy of whoever is elected as the winner to implement policies is decreased. Another thing that is related to trust is how satisfied you are with the way in which democracy works. And we know that if people get dissatisfied too much, this might in turn decrease their level of support for democracy as a form of regime, and it might make people a bit more tempted by looking towards more autocratic forms of regimes. But beyond just these attitudes, the level of trust that people have in elections might affect their willingness to go and vote. Mm-hmm. If you don't think that the process is a fair process, why would you bother voting? And in fact, there are many autocracies that hold elections that observe relatively low participation rates because people think that in any case the result is not going to be representative of the way in which people voted. And I guess trust is also related to violent protests. If you don't trust that the election was fair, if you don't trust that the result is correct, you might go and protest. So now to your question about the way in which voting procedures might affect trust. So voting procedures are, for instance, whether or not you have to register before voting, how long before the election you have to do that, whether you have to vote just in person or whether you're able to vote by sending a mail or voting before the election. All these things might affect, I would argue, trust through at least three mechanisms. The first is that they might affect access to the election. There are some voting procedures that make it harder for people to vote. For instance, imposing that in addition to voting, you first need to get registered on the voter rolls. And when, in particular, a certain group of the population believes that there is a systematic effort to prevent them from voting, to prevent their group from voting, let's say voters of a particular ethnicity, voters that live in a certain type of areas that observe voting ID laws putting in place, or that observe in some states a decreased number in the hours in which you can vote, so lower opening times in polling stations. All this can be interpreted as a way to restrict access and can therefore decrease trust. And conversely, efforts to facilitate access to voting might improve trust in the results of the election, particularly if they help more people come out and vote. The second is that voting procedures might in principle affect whether or not there is voter fraud. You can imagine that some types of voting procedures are more prone to voter fraud. For instance, you could imagine that voter fraud is more likely to happen if you allow people to vote by mail, because there will be a moment in which someone has to count the ballots, and this is done in a non-transparent way. And so in this moment, perhaps the results will be faked. And of course, if voting procedures affect voter fraud, they might then decrease trust. And I guess the third channel is, even if there is no actual impact on voter fraud, a certain type of voting procedures might affect people's perception that there is voter fraud. Right? So you could imagine that, for instance, voter ID laws have the benefit of making everything transparent because people's ID is controlled, and that this in turn could perhaps improve people's trust in how the election works. And just to give you one example from my research showing the importance of the perception that voters have about the way in which the process of the election works, I did some work in Kenya in 2013, where together with the Electoral Commission, we sent 11 million text messages to Kenyan voters about the election. And these text messages were aimed at increasing trust in how the election was working. So we were explaining all the work that the Electoral Commission was doing to make sure that the election would be free and fair, unlike previous elections that had taken place in the country. And we were surprised because first we observed that the text messages improved participation, so that was good news. But second, we observed that they decreased the level of trust, even though the messages were aiming to get the opposite result. And our interpretation is that this 2013 election did not take place as smoothly as the Kenyan Electoral Commission was hoping. In particular, they had put in place a number of biometric devices in polling stations to verify people's identity, and half of these devices didn't work on election day because there was no electricity or because there were other technical failures. On top of that, the Electoral Commission had promised that the results from the different polling stations would be aggregated electronically, so that everyone could follow the website of the Electoral Commission and see how the votes of each candidate were being aggregated, and this process also failed. And so, the text messages probably backfired because the process through which the election was working, all these voting procedures, in the end, disappointed voters. And let me just say to finish, what we know about the effects of voting procedures on trust in countries like the US and other countries that I would call established democracies. So the US, also European countries. So first, is there voter fraud in the US and in these countries? So historically, the answer was a very sound yes. There was, in the 19th century, a lot of voter fraud in the US, in France, in Europe. It was common for people to vote 30 times for one person, to be hired by a party, and the party would compensate you in money and in alcohol, and you would walk from one polling station to the other. These people had a name, they were called the repeaters, and so the voter fraud was very prevalent. And it was addressed through voting procedures. It was addressed by establishing a list of citizens allowed to vote in any polling station. So it was not possible for me to vote in 20 polling stations anymore. And vote buying was also addressed by making sure that people could vote secretly and by standardizing the size of the ballots. So instead of a party giving you a very big red ballot, that you would cast and that the party could verify that you had cast on election day, all the ballots would be of the same size. So today, what evidence we have? Well, the evidence is that there is extremely little voter fraud in a country like the US. It's very isolated whenever it happens. And on top of that, we know that procedures such as strict ID laws that arguably are trying to decrease voter fraud, well, don't have this impact because we start from a very low level, and whatever this low level is not decreasing when voter ID laws are put in place. Now, what do we know about the effects of such procedures, such as voter ID laws, on people's perception of voter fraud? The evidence that we have is that voter ID laws do not even improve people's perception of the fairness of the election process. That's some research that I did, in which we looked at a national election survey in the US, and we looked at a survey on the performance of the election administration, and we realized that states that adopt strict ID laws do not generate a belief that the election was free and fair, and they do not decrease the concern that voters have that there is voter fraud. There is, many voters perceive, actually 1/3 of Americans think that there is voter fraud, but this is not affected by strict ID laws. What we do not know is the extent to which convenience voting, so the ability to vote early, the ability to vote by sending a mail, we don't know whether that affects the perception of voter fraud. I think we would need research on this. My presumption would be that forms of electronic voting can potentially have a negative impact because when you vote electronically, you can start worrying whether perhaps the Russians or another power is interfering with the electronic vote. It's less transparent than if everyone has to put an envelope or a paper ballot in a ballot box. And the last thing I will say is that beyond just the formal, the legal voting procedures, we need to pay attention to the way in which these voting procedures are actually enforced and to the quality of election administration. In the US, in many states, there's way too few resources that are available for election administration, which results in, for instance, long waiting lines, which results in delays in counting ballots that were sent by mail. And all this, we have evidence from surveys, decrease people a perception that the election was free and fair. And so an easy thing that the US could do is to provide much more resources to make sure that the elections run in a smoother way and to make sure that the results of the election are known in a matter of a few hours and not in a matter of a few days or a few weeks.
Or in the same day as it is in Brazil, that you get in the end of the day, the counting, but still, there's a lot of, but very, very insightful information. Miriam, I would love to hear your perspective based on your experience and as a practitioner and observer of elections in very challenging environments, including in Venezuela, when you served there afterwards. I'd love to hear from you, how do these various dimensions that we've been discussing here this afternoon have played out in the case of the recent elections in Venezuela?
Thank you. Are you?
We can hear you, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure, it's an honor to be in this panel. As Bruna mentioned, I have experience as being an electoral authority in Venezuela. I was the vice president of the Electoral Council a while ago. That was the first election of Chavez, which I can say that election was free and fair. I can't say that the rest of ones were, but that one was. And of course, I follow elections very closely and really very interested in elections in general, and of course, the Venezuelan case. I think the Venezuelan case is very interesting. I don't know how much you know and how much you follow Venezuela, but it's a very interesting combination of the difficulties of what you all have mentioned here, like the stress between conventional media, social media, the use of AI, all the procedures that are typical of a developed country, free and fair country, with the characteristics of an authoritarian regime. So the combination of new sophisticated resources and practices and procedures with very old-fashioned practices and procedures typical of authoritarian or dictatorial regimes are very present in Venezuela. So I think that makes the case very interesting. You may know, you may have heard that there were elections in Venezuela, presidential elections on July 28th, in a very restrictive environment where the opposition was forced to, decided to participate in the elections in a very unfair setting, not free, not fair, not competitive, with all sorts of limitations, massive abusive use of resources on the side of the government, disqualification of candidates. In the case of the candidate that won the opposition primary, Maria Corina Machado, she was not allowed to run. The electoral calendar was just delirious. They decided to hold this election in March. The calendar was published in March. The elections took place in late July. There was only 1 month for people to register, to expand the registration. The taken office will, the elected president will take office in January next year, so there are more than 5 months between the moment the elections took place until the inauguration. Very capricious. There is massive censorship in the country. No traditional media is open to dissident or opposition voices. Not mentioning candidates. There are very, very few spaces, and the digital space has been the space where the dissident voices, the pro-democracy players from civil society parties express themselves. There is a pretty vibrant and interesting digital media space, but with increased censorship. Many outlets have been banned. The last account I have is like 66 in this year and 17 outlets and just after the elections. And this has been very carefully documented. On the other hand, opposition faces all sorts of harassment, threats. Opposition leaders have been detained, are in jail, just for the fact of being members of opposition parties. However, despite all these very difficult and very non-democratic conditions, the opposition decided to participate in the election. They participated with a very strong, united platform, and were able to overcome these very significant barriers and obstacles, and won in an amazing fashion. And how does the opposition know that they won? Because in Venezuela there is an electronic system, and I think that would be very interesting to discuss how in a dictatorship or an authoritarian regime there is an electronic system. That is the only element that provides certain trust and certain certainty to the voters. In this case, the opposition used all the tools, and because it has learned to understand and use the system in a very effective way, and was able to demonstrate through gathering all the tally sheets that the machines produce and publish 83% of those tally sheets that demonstrated that the opposition candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, obtained close to 67% of the vote, while Maduro, the incumbent, obtained 30% of the vote. And that's clearly documented. Anybody here can access the webpage where all this information is there, and you can easily see what the results were based on the actual official tally sheets that the machines produce. However, the government, it's a dictatorial government, did not recognize the opposition's victory, and claimed that they won the election, that Maduro won the election, without providing any sorts of proof, any tally sheet, any disaggregated information. They just came out with these results with no evidence, and their expectation that they will be inaugurated, or Maduro will be inaugurated in on January 10th. So of course the opposition is involved in a very, uphill but steady struggle to make this victory recognized globally and to generate some kind of transition within the country. Venezuela has a very long tradition of electoral processes. Actually, the first time universal suffrage was established and enshrined in Venezuela was in 1946, which is pretty early, and that entailed anybody above 18 years old, women, men, were able to vote, and that wasn't a short period of democracy. Then when democracy was regained in Venezuela after 1958, there were systematic elections for all sorts of levels of government. So there is a very rich tradition of elections in Venezuela. And maybe paradoxically, during this regime, the Chavismo, which started with Hugo Chavez, has continued with Nicolás Maduro, the regime has used elections as a means of legitimizing itself. And besides their, say, tactical or transactional use of elections, there's also something that's very embedded in Venezuelan culture, which is the trust on elections, the belief that elections are the real path, the necessary path, the civilized, institutional, democratic path to select your ruling officials and to generate a transfer of power. And unfortunately, in a dictatorship, the transfer of power is the issue, and that's what the Venezuelans are struggling for now. But I think, it's very interesting to see, on the one hand, how the government used all these tools, AI, social media, voter suppressing, all sorts of techniques, disqualifying candidates, but how the opposition also used social media, AI, and citizen mobilization, generating alternative ways of generating trust and elections to mobilize people in a very impressive way and to win the election. So I think, as Henry said, AI may be a tool that some deem as very useful for governments and authoritarian regimes, and I believe it is, but it can also be used wisely by Democrats, and the same applies to social media. Yep. Social media and trying to circumvent the different obstacles that the electoral procedures defined by the regime in this case can affect. I would just want to highlight one, which was not being able, the opposition could not overcome. Venezuela, as you may know, has suffered a massive migration of Venezuelan citizens. Nowadays, there are close to almost 8 million Venezuelans living abroad, which is like 25% of the population, because of the economic and political disarray in the country. And voters living abroad were not allowed to vote. There are so many limitations of all sorts that they couldn't vote. So from those, say, 8 million voters, Venezuelans, citizens, at least 4 or 5 million, depending on the accuracy of these figures, could have been voters, and they were not allowed to vote. On the other hand, inside Venezuela, because, as I said, the period for additional registration was so short, and with all sorts of limitations, at least 3 million, mainly young people, young voters, could not register. So this is it's a massive process of voter suppression that is not subtle. It's not whether you need an ID or you can or cannot vote by mail, or there's some tricky little
Yeah.
things happening, but was a massive voter suppression.
Yeah, absolutely. There was nothing about subtle in that, right?
Yeah,
It was
no.
very blunt, let's say. So I will take two questions from the audience, one after the other, and then I will kindly ask you to be very brief. Do we have some questions from our audience? So we have one over there and one here. If you can stand and ask using the microphone.
So wouldn't you think that once AI allows the fabrication of stories and image and so on at no cost, then everything becomes cheap talk, and there's again a demand for reputation, which newspaper or maybe university can provide in terms of validity of information. That is, maybe when the cost of fabricating stories that look credible enough is medium, then maybe this is the peak of the, difficult to trust. But when it's costless to fabricate story, maybe the equilibrium is that you cannot trust anything.
Thank you.
What sort of government policy or media regulation can exist to help fight against deepfake fabrication of making false images or videos of potentially government officials with completely false information in them? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Julia, would you like to address the first question? Could you hear it well over there?
Can you? I was going to ask you if you could repeat it.
Well,
Yes, I was saying, with respect to the fabrication, AI, the big threat, I was wondering whether at the point where it is almost costless to fabricate credible stories and images and so on, then wouldn't the equilibrium be that you don't trust anything on social media? And so there's back to some need or demand for paying for reputation, whether it is newspaper, whether it is university, and
If it were to be the case, it would be a good news, a great news. But if you read, for example, I think one of the guy that wrote the first very good books on this topic of social media and all the associated risk is Eli Pariser, who called it the filter bubble. And the first characteristics of the filter bubble is that people do not know about it and never realize when they are within the bubble. So for people like you and I talking about this topic, basically it does mean that we will, I guess, spend less and less time on social media and just be willing to spend more money just to buy the New York Times or Le Monde or the Guardian or whatever, or Datafolha, I guess in Brazil or whatever. Media can be considered as independent media outlets. But for the majority of the people, one thing, just one statistic that is very striking. If you ask people, they read an article, and then you ask them, what is the source of the article? They're going to answer Facebook or Twitter or Google News. They never check the original source. They think that whatever they're going to consume, at the end of the day, they do not care about who is producing the news because they do not realize that there is an issue. And when before I was talking about increasing information inequality, this is also part of the story. They do not realize that it can make a big difference to read a news story on A versus than to read the news story on B. And this is where everything linked to AI or misinformation is becoming more and more and more dangerous because it should make us more careful. But given that it is so easy to produce at no cost a lot of content, people are lost in the midst of all this content and they forget, in a sense, like to opt in credible source of information. So they're even like more disinformed as before. And this is, I guess, I'm going to finish on that, where I really do think that one of the most important policy, which is not going to be at a very high cost, that we need to implement is media education at school, but very early, in a sense, for kids. At 6, 7, 8, at 10 years old, we should educate people to what is the news, what is a credible source of information, what is a news article, what is fake news, what is disinformation. Because basically, by doing that, where kids are 8, this is the way we are going to, let's say, train or educate our future citizens and adults.
Excellent. Someone would like to address the question on the regulation. It's a 1 million question. Henry, would you?
I don't think that
Do
there
you
is, I don't think that there is any very good way to actually regulate it, because it's extremely difficult to tell what has been produced in these ways and what has not. So there is, so OpenAI has apparently introduced some techniques for watermarking that is for allowing you to see what, which images, which text have been generated using their systems, but they have not released any of the information about how to do this into the public. And also, given that there is sufficient, there are sufficiently good versions of this which are open source or which have leaked. And sort of one of Meta's models actually leaked. And once you have the weights, once you have the weighted vectors, you're basically able to do anything you want with it. It is still going to be possible for people to produce this stuff in the wild. So I don't think there's any very good way to really regulate it effectively. Equally, it's this is a somewhat worse version of a problem that we have had for a long, long time. So, so I think that rather than trying to regulate content, you have to think, as Julia is saying, in terms of sources and either educating people as to the sources or having institutional frameworks which recognize reliable sources. And here, one of the interesting turnarounds we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years is Wikipedia. So it used to be that you used to tell students, don't use Wikipedia no matter what. Now, if you actually look at Wikipedia's reliable sources policy, it actually does this quite well. And it actually seems, despite all the technological challenges, to be very, very good at ensuring that people who use problematic sources of one sort or another get their additions very rapidly deleted.
Excellent. Just one example that I want to bring is about what Julia said. In Brazil, there was an experiment made with a group of people in the millennials who went through the experience of fact-checking things through elections. And after they went through that, they kind of developed this investigative journalist capabilities. They were less likely to then reshare other news that were coming from non-reliable sources and that were likely to contain either misinformation or disinformation. So that was one of the examples of building those capabilities also later on. Please, Vincent.
Yes, so just on the regulation side, I have two colleagues at the Harvard Business School who produced a paper recently that I think makes a useful distinction between two types of content that you might want to regulate, particularly on social media. The first type of content is content such as fake news that has the potential to cause harm, for instance, by persuading someone of something that is not true and therefore potentially affecting how they vote. And the second is content that directly generates harm, or the connection between the content and harm is immediate. For instance, content such as, let's gather at this place to try and overthrow the government, or this is the address of such and such congressman, congressperson that we disagree with. So you can see how that content is really problematic because there is an immediate potential for harm. And what these researchers argue is that the second type of content can be and should be regulated, for instance, by immediately hiding the address of a person that is provided to target the hatred against that person. But the first type of content is very hard to regulate. And the reason why it's very hard to regulate is that to regulate that type of content, so fake news, for instance, what you would need is social media to have a set of rules that everyone trusts. And you would need trust not just in these rules, but also trust in the fact that the social media are going to apply these rules in an impartial way. And we are very far from that trust environment. And absent that trust, any attempt to regulate that type of content might backlash because it might further decrease people's trust in what social media are doing. And I thought that this distinction was useful, and they make another point, which is that in the optimistic scenario in which social media could release a set of rules and then abide by the set of rules, one issue with releasing publicly the set of rules that you're going to apply is that, of course, once these rules are public, it's much easier for people who want to misuse the social media to go around these rules. And so there is an argument to be made for opaque handling of the first type of content rather than rule-based handling.
Excellent. I have one follow-up question for you, Miriam, which is in the case of Venezuela these days, we saw some people arguing that we should avoid the Guaidó mistake. And then I would like to hear from you, what do you think would have changed perhaps the outcome if the international recognition would happen faster or not, either in the region, in the Americas, or globally?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. I mean, among the democratic countries, there's a very clear rule. Whoever obtains the most amount of votes is the president-elect. And this is what happened in Venezuela. There was this person, Edmundo González, who participated again in a very unfair, uncompetitive, and unfree election, however, obtained the majority of the vote. What Venezuelans are demanding is the recognition of that reality, which has been overly established and proved as the real outcome of the election. So far, the Electoral Council in Venezuela, the CNE, has not provided not even one element to prove that Maduro won the election. So it's very different from the previous situation whereby there was an interim government that was recognized by a large number of countries in the world because the person that assumed the role of the head of the interim government had been elected as a member of the National Assembly, and at the moment of and at a certain point, because he was the president of the National Assembly and was appointed based on Venezuela's succession rules as the president. There was a source of legitimacy there in the sense that he was elected by the people, but was elected by the people to perform as a deputy. And an unusual situation, he was appointed the president of, or self-appointed the president of the country. But this situation is very different. The legitimacy of Mr. González is absolutely clear. It derives from massive participation and voting in, again, a not free and fair election, but an election that took place and the opposition was willing to participate in the election. And not only that the opposition was willing to participate, there were international agreements whereby, or let's put it differently, the opposition and the government engaged in an agreement to allow for a free and fair election with the support and backing of relevant players in the international community. That means that this election and the result needs to be recognized by the international community. And of course, there's still pushback. The international community is still requesting the government, that is the CNE, the Electoral Council that is run by the government, to provide the proof of Maduro's election. It's obvious that they will not be able to provide anything. That stage of requesting the proof of his victory has been exhausted. I mean, the coming stage has to be recognizing Mr. Gonzalez as the president-elect, and in January 10, increased pressure to have him taking office instead of Maduro, that has no legitimacy, has not been able to prove not even one of his votes, and I mean, I think it's a very clear-cut situation in terms of who is the legitimate president and who is the president-elect right now, and who should be the actual president after January 10th.
Excellent. Thank you, Miriam. Do we have another question from the audience? We still have some time. If no, I have one then. We have one? Yes, please.
Hi. I was curious to make the comparison kind of between France and the United States. And I think obviously in recent French elections, it seemed as though there's higher levels of confidence in those elections and their results, as compared to the elections in the United States in 2020 and possibly in 2024. So is that accurate? And if so, why, or what is the difference in between the confidence levels in France, which is also a similarly kind of established democracy as the United States?
I think it's addressed to our French colleagues. Julia?
Bonsoir. I begin that's true that there is more confidence, and the thing that we saw in the US in 2020, we never saw that in France, at least in recent decades. But at the same time, if you look at turnout, people do vote less today in France than what they do in the US. So it means that even if they trust more, in the sense, the democratic system, they do not believe into it enough to go and pay the cost of voting. They do not turn out. And then, you are looking at the past presidential election was 2022. Now we had recent political events in France with unplanned elections, legislative elections, general elections in June and July 2024. Then there were no clear majority. It took nearly 2 months to the president to pick a prime minister. Now the prime minister is still trying to set up a government while the election took place at the end of June. So if you were, I guess, to survey people in France as of today on their trust regarding the democratic system, trust is going to be low. Not to say that it will be like in the US, okay, nobody is going to say that, okay, this guy stole the election, they were no. But the fact that people might not believe in the utility of voting, or in the fact that at the end of the day, their political preferences are going to translate into actual policies, I guess this is what is happening. And if you are from Germany, or if you are from the Netherlands, or if you are from Belgium, you might think that, okay, these are very normal process. It's not because you have an election that you have a government the day after. You need to have some coalition. We need to take time to have a prime minister who is going to obtain a majority, etc., which is true in the context of Belgium or the Netherlands, of Germany, or even in the context of Spain. But this is not something we are used to in France. And I spend time every day, because I guess this is part of my job, just trying to watch a little bit every news channel, Citizen Watch, just to get a sense of how people are informed. And if you were to watch, for example, CNews, which is the French equivalent of Fox News, what you will see is that it has been 2 months where what they're trying to do is to build distrust towards our electoral system.
Thank you. Someone else would like to address? Would you like to answer?
So just a quick word. So, big picture, there are signs of democratic backsliding, both in France and in the US, and I find this quite worrying because these are two of the oldest democracies in the world. And so today, democratic backsliding concerns not just relatively recent democracies, such as, Hungary or India, or countries like Russia or Turkey, but also these oldest democracies. And when I say democratic backsliding, I'm thinking, for instance, about the rise in populism, the rise in polarization, so increased hatred between voters of different sides, etc. Now, of course, when you look at the detail, the symptoms of this backsliding differ across countries. For instance, a striking difference is that in France, participation has been declining since the 1970s. And in the US, where historically the level of participation is lower than in most other Western democracies, participation has increased a little bit since the 2000s, which could be due to the hatred between Republicans and Democrats. You really don't want the leader of the other party to come to power. And then in terms of the trust in the result of the election, I think it's correct that in France that trust is higher. In the US, there is still to this date a majority of Republican voters who say that they don't think that Biden got elected in 2020. That's extremely high. There is no similar fraction of people in France who don't believe that Macron was elected by a majority of voters. And so why is that? I guess it's going back to the voting procedure, the fact that the voting procedure in France is much more robust. You vote by putting a ballot in an envelope. It's a very simple ballot, with the name of the candidate. It's not a complex ballot that people sometimes don't understand. The voting system is exactly the same all over the country, whereas in the US, there are basically 50 different systems, one per state. And so the result of all this is that by 8 p.m., on election day, when the last polling stations close, we have a very accurate estimate of who the winner will be. Whereas in the US, it takes a very long time to count ballots, and sometimes, like in 2020, it can take multiple days, perhaps this year as well, or even multiple weeks before we know who is the winner of the election. And so there has been the recognition for a long time that the way in which elections are administered in this country is a disgrace. This was recognized first in 2020, when it took a very long time to understand whether Bush or Al Gore had won the election. There was a Help America Vote Act in 2002 that was passed that dedicated, I think, $4 billion to improve the way in which elections are administered in the US, but this is still very far from a robust system, and I think there needs to be much more resources allocated to this in the forthcoming elections.
I'm glad you mentioned democratic backsliding, because we just heard from Miriam the remarks about how Maduro is not legit to govern these days in Venezuela and how he claimed to win. And we saw it happening as well in Brazil recently, where I often say that Brazil and the US are countries looking each other in the mirror. We somehow mimic each other. But I want to hear from you, what is the role of politicians in all this, therefore? So we see politicians claiming that they won the election when the votes, the counting was not, it's different. So what is the role of politicians in all this?
Yeah, I think, again, the Venezuelan case is pretty interesting. Compared to what has been described about France, what has been described about the US, and all we know about the way the US system works, and I vote here, there are problems. But there is not, a deliberate intention from the government and the politicians and everybody. There is some have the intention of questioning and really harming the integrity of the electoral process. But there's what we can see for ordinary citizens here in the U.S., people can go and vote, and whatever they vote is respected, and that happens in other countries. I think, I mean, it's kind of, sometimes I feel there's an say, deliberate effort, and it's an artificial effort to, or let's say, there's an deliberate effort that is very that turns into an artificial delegitimizing of the electoral system, when these electoral systems basically translate and are faithful to voters' desires and voters' preferences. In the case of Venezuela, I mean, many people doubted about the electoral system with very strong reasons. This is controlled by the government. There were all these obstacles. However, the trust that people felt towards the candidates of the opposition, their willingness to look for change through the electoral process, was energizing, force to draw millions of Venezuelans to the voting polls, despite all the obstacles and the reality of a rigged and dysfunctional electoral system. So politicians have a very important role. They have an important role on preserving the integrity of the electoral system, on being responsible in the way they talk about the electoral system, they use the electoral system, and are very important in terms of generating enthusiasm, hope, trust, and reasons to vote. Because after all, I think voting is one of the main, inventions of humanity, in the sense of it's a privileged way of channeling our differences and allowing large societies, 300 million people in the U.S., billions and a billion in China, in India. Well, China is a different system, but in India, in large societies and in small societies, to express their views, to channel their differences, and coming out with an outcome that can and should be recognized by everybody. That's an amazing device that humanity has invented. I mean, there's nothing equivalent to voting to allow for people to, large number of people, to reach an agreement and a decision, and undermining that ability and undermining that path towards a peaceful, institutional, consensual decision-making is very dangerous.
Yeah.
I think politicians have a very important role there.
Thank you, Miriam. Henry.
So I think one of the great pieces of political science of the last 40 or 50 years is a chapter in a book by Adam Przeworski, a Polish political scientist. It's called Democracy in the Market. The rest of the book is fine, but not nearly as good, which gives a very cynical, but I think very useful understanding of democracy, which is based around the interests of elites and parties. And the question that Przeworski asks is, if we think of sort of the leaders as being economically rational, they're self-interested, they're somewhat selfish, why in the name of God would they ever give up power when they lose an election? And so he then comes up with a set of arguments. So more or less he argues that a democracy by definition, or at least by his definition, is a system in which parties lose elections. And he argues that this is going to work in a world where they, so they look at the choices that they make. If they accept their loss, they have some possibility of winning again, because there is uncertainty, the radical uncertainty in democracy and the democratic sort of outcomes of future elections. But if they lose, they have to, if they refuse to accept their loss, there has to be some reason why they selfishly decide that they are better off doing this. And then he argues that if you don't get this, if you get this then democracy can be a kind of a self-enforcing equilibrium. If you don't have it, then the expectations which hold democracy together can unravel. So I think that this really does suggest that political elites, leaders, are crucially important. And when they refuse to accept results, if they are not punished in some way, then this can create a sort of a very problematic sort of continued sort of unraveling of the expectations that we need to hold democracy together. So I think that January 2020, 21 was one crisis. The second crisis was the complete inability of politicians to quickly converge around punishing Donald Trump in some effective and immediate fashion for his defection from the bargain that all of us need to live together in for democracy to actually be stable.
Thank you. Well, it's 6:30, so I have to wrap up. I want to thank and congratulate all the organizers for putting together this brilliant panel and for inviting me to moderate here today and learn so much from all of you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.